Hello everyone, my name is Philip, and today I'm going to be talking about an absolutely beautiful instrument, and that is the duduk. So this is the duduk. It is, if I pick it up, it is a double-reeded wind instrument, right? So it has a reed. It's similar in construction and style to a Western oboe, for example, although it obviously has somewhat of a different sound as well. Now, the duduk is especially associated with the region of Central Asia, Anatolia, or the Southern Caucasus region, which includes countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. And there are local names and slightly different variants of this instrument in these different countries or regions. So in Iran and Azerbaijan, there is an instrument called the Balaban, which in a lot of ways is essentially the same instrument as the duduk. Some would say it's just a different name. And in Turkey, for example, you have an instrument called the mey, which is also quite similar, but with a slightly different sound. And that's an important point, that while many would say that especially the balaban and the duduk are simply different names for the same instrument, there can be regional differences in terms of construction and material and the scale of the holes on the instrument and playing techniques and so on. And there can be a little debates and fighting going on about who sort of owns the instrument, or in which culture or region this instrument actually originates. We're not going to get into any of those cultural debates today, but in this particular form that I have here, and the name duduk is associated primarily with Armenia and Armenian history and music culture. Now, the name duduk, it's not entirely certain, but it seems that the name duduk actually comes from a word meaning whistle, so whistling. There are another theory also claiming that it comes from a Russian word originally that means pipe, essentially, which would also make sense. So it isn't entirely clear. The history of this instrument is very long. Obviously, reed instruments and reed flutes have existed for thousands and thousands of years. It's one of the earliest forms of instruments that were invented by civilizations all across the world. That doesn't mean that any old ancient reed instrument is essentially the duduk, because this is obviously quite different from those old reed flutes. Now, the history of the duduk and similar instruments isn't all that known. There is a lot of conflicting theories and claims about its origins. Some say it's 12,000 years old, some say it's 3,000 years old, others say it's 1,500 years old. It's hard to say. When we try to find information about the history and development of the duduk, it becomes clear that not a lot of historical research has been done to find the history and development of these instruments in particular, but there are a few recurring features when we talk about the history of the duduk. So while there are a lot of reed instruments in history that goes back to way back to ancient times, as is always the case with a lot of instruments, since instruments and cultures, material culture and all this changes and develops all the time, and there can be small changes here and there between regions and over a certain period of time. It's hard to say and pinpoint exactly when we can say that here it becomes the duduk, or here it becomes the balaban, or whatever is the case. But a common way to trace this back in history is to say that duduk music originates during the rule of Tigran the Great, who was an Armenian king who ruled back in the 1st century BC. It's possible that this instrument dates back then. It could be a little older, it could be younger. One theory behind how it developed over time is that it started basically as a reed flute, like any other reed flute, and the mouthpiece was carved at the end of the flute, and then it would be played like that. And then eventually, because the reed is such a fragile material, a body made of wood was added to the instrument, and then over time the body became longer and longer and the reed section became shorter and shorter until we find this construction that we see today. Indeed, one of the great masters of duduk playing today, Jivan Gasparian, said, quote, "First, the duduk was nothing more than a reed, or gamish. Not the reed that we have today, but a longer reed, which formed the whole duduk. Over the years, the size of the reed grew smaller, and an extra part was added at the end." So it seems clear that instruments similar to the duduk, with the kind of oboe-like cylindrical form, has been played for a long, long time in this wider region. Now, the duduk is essentially made up of two parts. The first is the reed, which is known as the gamish. This is a double reed. It is made of a certain plant or a certain reed that grows in this region. And this is what gives, or well, one of two aspects that gives the duduk its very characteristic sound. The reed is played at the end right here, and then it has this mechanism where you put this piece of wood around it, and this is essentially how you tune the instrument. So the double reed will open up, and then you will adjust this mechanism here to open and close it to your liking, or until it is in tune essentially. And then it's a little cap like this, so you can keep it closed for when you're not playing. The second part of the instrument is the body of the instrument. This is where a lot of the resonance is happening. This is what gives the duduk its warm, characteristic sound, at least, again, one of the two aspects. But in Armenia, and for the duduk in particular, the wood used is almost exclusively apricot wood, which grows in that region, and that wood is also very important in giving the duduk that characteristic sound, which differs it from other similar instruments in the region. So if we listen to a Balaban in Azerbaijan, or if we listen to, particularly if we listen to a mey in a Turkish ensemble, the mey has a very different sound from the duduk. The duduk is a lot softer and warmer, and the mey has a more nasally kind of sound. So while the instruments are very similar, they have clear regional characteristics, and the Armenian duduk is constructed from this reed section and then a body made of apricot wood. So the instrument is essentially played like an instrument like a flute, right? So it has these holes, and the instrument is tuned. Today it's tuned in a more regular Western kind of scale. So if I play the full octave on the duduk, it sounds something like this. So as you can tell, that's essentially a major scale. Now, that isn't necessarily always how it was constructed, or how the basic scale of the duduk was made. The duduk in general has a range of a little more than a full octave. So I would say maybe an octave and a half if you really are skilled enough at playing. But that's actually a pretty important part in the history of this instrument, is that even though it obviously has a long history, it goes back at least many centuries, but the duduk as we find it today, as in this particular form, with this particular sound and with this scale, might actually be quite a modern development or a modern invention. Sources suggest that in the 1920s and 1930s, there were serious reconstructions and renovations made to the duduk, primarily associated with figures like a V.G. Buni. Now, he and others improved the duduk in ways that took it away from its more traditional use in folk ensembles outside for festive occasions, and instead added added a lower register to the instrument, a slightly different scale, and essentially reconstructed it in a way that it fit better into a more Europeanized music culture or music, European music ensembles. This was the time when Armenia was under the Soviet Union, and so that was very important for the later development of the duduk into the form that it has today. So while the origins of the instrument is probably very old, the form of the instrument that we find today might not date back more than 100 years. But that really doesn't make that much of a difference, because instruments are always changing. They're always evolving and developing with new times and new requirements in the music that's played. So, for example, because it used to be played primarily in folk ensembles and so on, we can hear earlier recordings of the duduk from before the 20th or 1920s and 1930s that sound quite different from the duduk as it sounds today. It has a sound that's more akin to something like the zorna, a very sort of nasally high-pitched sound used for more festive occasions. In any case, the duduk, because of all of these features and factors, has become a very important part in the national identity of Armenia. Armenians are really proud of this instrument, and they see it as a symbol of Armenian culture in a lot of ways. And that's definitely a legitimate claim. This instrument has existed and been played in the Armenian region for a long time. It has been an important part of the music culture in that region. There's no doubt about that. The way that the duduk is played is obviously by blowing into the reed of the instrument. And so when you play the instrument, your cheeks are supposed to puff up basically to store some air, and then you do the vibrato. The vibrato is made by essentially moving your jaws up and down, like. Now, one of the most characteristic ways of playing this, or techniques of playing it, is what is known as circular breathing. This is also used by players of other instruments like the didgeridoo, for example, or some flute players. So the technique is that one will play and you sort of gather air into your cheeks like a hamster when you play, like that. And then when you are running out of air, you quickly use the air left in your cheeks, you blow it out, while simultaneously inhaling through the nose, which creates a circular breathing, which ideally will enable you to play an extended note for an infinite amount of time, because you're constantly replenishing your breath so that you can keep going. Now, this was actually a very important feature of the way that the duduk was played traditionally. So the way in a traditional ensemble, in the folk music of Armenia previously, it was usually one duduk with a second duduk that played a drone note. So you had one duduk who played a continuous drone, just a single note throughout the song. And if you want to be able to do a drone for that long, you need to be able to do the circular breathing, or it's going to sound really weird. So usually there was one drone duduk, a solo playing duduk, and then also often a percussion instrument that accompanied them. So that was the traditional ensemble, so 3 musicians basically. So the reeds come in different variants. There are usually what's known as soft reeds, medium soft reeds, and hard reeds. The hard reeds are the kind that are the hardest to play, fittingly, but it's also the reed that gives the softest and warmest sound. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the soft reeds, which are a lot easier to play. Usually when you start out playing the duduk, you start by playing the soft reeds. And when you play the soft reed, the sound is quite different. It's not as soft, it's more nasally, more high-pitched, and, well, technically not high-pitched, but it sounds lighter in tone. But it's not necessarily that that sound is worse and that the hard reeds sound better. It simply works for different circumstances. So for the more modern use of the instrument in soundtrack form or in those kinds of situations, the harder or medium reeds work really well because it creates that soft sound. This one that I'm playing throughout the video is basically a kind of medium-sized reed, or a medium reed essentially. But if I change the reed to a softer reed, you can hear that the sound will be quite different. So this is what a softer reed can sound like. So as you can tell, that's quite a different sound. It's a lot easier on the breath. It requires less effort on the player's part to play, but it has a much more nasally kind of sound, which works wonderfully if you're playing outside and you're playing at a wedding and it's a more festive atmosphere. But this would not sound as good on a, on the soundtrack to Gladiator, for example, which wants to create that sort of warmer, more organic sound. The duduk exists in many different forms. It exists in different tunings. So this one that I'm holding here is a duduk that is tuned in B, which is a bit of a higher register. But if you look before me here on the table, there are a few different duduks. So this is the B one that I played. This one here is a B flat duduk, and this one is actually a lot more common because B flat is, the B flat duduk allows one to play songs in D and C very easily. Having songs in D or C is very common in music from the Middle East. So that's a pretty common version of the instruments. There is also this A duduk, a duduk tuned in A, which some would say is the sort of bass version of the duduk. It's a bit longer, which means it's also harder to play because it requires more air to go through the body. So it requires a little more breath on your part. And yeah, so it exists in these are just 3 examples. It exists in both in lower, sort of more the bass registers. There are like bass duduks essentially, and then there are a lot smaller duduks that are in a much higher register. So the whole spectrum essentially. Now, as I've been playing this instrument, I'm sure a lot of you have been recognizing the sound. It's quite a recognizable sound because this instrument in the last few decades especially has become really popular for using in movies and in video games and some contemporary music as well. It really works well for a lot of different circumstances. Often it's used to invoke a kind of Middle Eastern atmosphere. So you see, like in a movie, you have shots of the desert. It's quite likely you'll hear some duduk over that. And it's been made famous in movies like Gladiator, where one of the great masters of duduk playing today, Jivan Gasparian, plays on that soundtrack. He unfortunately passed away not very long ago, so may he rest in peace. He was truly one of the great masters in the modern world and one of the most important figures in also bringing the duduk to a worldwide mainstream audience by being featured on soundtracks like that to Gladiator. Another famous example, and the place where I discovered the duduk for the first time, is in Martin Scorsese's film The Last Temptation of Christ, in which the soundtrack was made by the composer Peter Gabriel, which is a film that essentially tells the story of Jesus from a slightly different perspective, but that soundtrack is just incredible. It's probably one of the greatest soundtracks to any movie ever composed, and that heavily features the duduk, and which also made it quite a well-known instrument. So today the duduk is used all over the place in movies, in video games, in contemporary pop music. Today the duduk is represented by various players and masters, both Armenian and non-Armenian. It's become a very popular and famous instrument around the world. It is perhaps most famously represented by figures like the already mentioned Jivan Gasparian, who to many is considered the greatest of them all. But there are also others like Levon Minassian and Georg Dabagian, as well as some younger players like my good friend Arsen Petrosyan, whose recordings you should definitely check out. He's an amazing duduk player and a really great guy. And so I am trying to keep a humble attitude when I play it, since I don't have a direct connection to that culture. I just really love this instrument, and by no means am I an expert or anything like that. I still consider myself very much a beginner on this instrument, but I love to employ it in various ways when I compose music. It's a really great tool for arranging and composing. If you have any song, whatever genre it is, essentially, adding some duduk just immediately adds some like really great organic feel. And so I use the duduk on a lot of my recordings. I started playing it around, I think 10 years ago, and I really wish I had had more time over the years to practice and become better. I learned the instrument so that I was good enough to play and to use for composing, but I have never really went beyond any sort of beyond the beginner stages. Keep that in mind as I play this a little bit more for you, that I am in no way an expert. I am still very much a beginner, and that I simply am a great admirer of this instrument and the incredible sound that it has and the atmosphere that it is able to create. So I'm going to just play you a little bit of the duduk so you can get a sense of the sound after hearing all of this wonderful history and technical detail. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this introduction to the Duduk interesting, and I hope you'll agree with me that this is just one of the most absolutely beautiful instruments that your ears can experience. Look forward to more videos in the future that introduce you to various instruments like this. You can see a few of them behind me already. I have a bit of a collection. I have a bit of a problem in terms of that, but there's plenty of great and very interesting stuff to talk about. So I hope to see you in a future video, and I'll continue this discussion gladly in the comments as well. Let me know what you thought, and yeah, I'll see you next time.